project. We're going to get started in the next 2 minutes. We wanted to give a little bit more time for people to join us, and we'll get started straight away. If you could please in the chat let us know where you're coming from, the location and the organization that you're here from. That'd be great. If you can communicate with us in the chat, and we'll be making more than enough time. We hope to make at least 15 minutes available for a Q&A at the end. So please, if any thoughts or questions come up during the session today, please add them in the chat, and we look forward to addressing those and getting back to you at the end of the session. Okay, so it's just gone 2 minutes past 2, and bearing in mind that we've got quite a lot of good information to share with you, and want to make sure that we fill your time with what you're expecting. We wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what to expect from today's session. I hope you can all see the screen. If you can't, let me know, and we'll see if we can sort that out. But the sections that we wanted to cover with you today, first of all, some introductions of who's going to be speaking with you today. Tracey Chambers from Grow and the Clothing Bank, there she is. James Hicks from the Impact Management Project, and then yours truly, myself. The next section, James is going to lead in telling you a little bit more about the Impact Management Project. What are the IMP norms and how are they applied to impact reporting? And then we're going to go into a case study talking about how the IMP norms have been applied to grow Educare centers, and the impact report and statement that we worked on with Grow and with the IMP. We're going to look to hear from Tracey, and I'm also going to be sharing some of our thoughts around the purpose for Grow Educare, how the impact report has made a difference to their organization and what their plans are in utilizing impact reporting into the future. And then what we believe are further opportunities for impact reporting and how they can make a difference in your organizations. And so we hope that you walk away not only with some information and that you've enjoyed hearing an example, but also an opportunity where you'll be able to apply this to your own thinking and to your own work, and ultimately lead to greater change, greater support, and building trust with both your investors and donors. And just as a final remark before we go into the session, the title is intentional. When we look at impact reporting, our perspective on this is that it builds success with donors and investors. It's not only for donors and investors. This is something which you need to bring your donors and investors into that conversation. It becomes a collaborative exercise. And in that spirit, we have invited not only our partner, who is part of the process of putting this together, Grow Educare Centers, but also the IMP to join us. And so I'm going to introduce just very briefly the speakers for today. Our first speaker is going to be James Hicks. He is the Impact Data Lead at the Impact Management Project based in London. He is dialing in from the UK today. I'm very happy to have him. Tracey Chambers, somebody that I'm sure a lot of you know very well. Her and her amazing team have done incredible things with the Clothing Bank, and the focus of today's session, Grow Educare Centers. And then myself, I'm the co-founder of Relativ Impact, an impact advisory firm that assists organizations not only with impact reporting, but with their impact life cycle as well. So we look forward to sharing some of what we have found, looking at Grow in particular, but also to share some of our wider insights, and in particular, introduce you to the Impact Management Project. And with that, I hand over to James.
Thanks so much, Colin, and hi everyone. It's great to be with you all today. So what is the Impact Management Project? So we are a forum for bringing together a diverse range of organizations to really talk about what they agree on and what they don't agree on when it comes to impact management. And a core part of our work today is facilitating a network of public good standard setters, who you can see pictured here today. And these are organizations that we feel that taken all together really have the potential to provide complete and really generally accepted principles, frameworks and standards for impact measurement and management. And you can see that within the network, there are a number of the main players in corporate disclosure of sustainability information. So the likes of GRI and SASB, for example. I won't rattle through them all, but and then we've got representation from development, finance, and the investor perspective through the IFC, PRI, and the GIN. We have the OECD bringing policy perspective, Social Value International, which emphasizes the need for stakeholder voice. A number of the UN bodies and the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is doing some great work on public good benchmarking methodologies. And this group of standard setters, we feel represents a significant breadth of audience, and we think a sufficient influence in the market to bring about a kind of system level change in how impact is measured and managed and reported. And the IMP's role is as a facilitator working with these organizations as they coordinate their efforts towards achieving greater coherence between their content, so that ultimately it's easier for enterprises and investors to engage with it as a system. And that work's divided into 3 sections of practice, performance, and benchmarking, which are just briefly the processes and procedures that would be conducive to good impact management, and then performance. So once you know what the processes are, what information should be reported, and then benchmarking. So how to think about ratings and valuation techniques. And if we move to the next slide, please, Colin. Prior to that, the Impact Management Project between 2016 and 2018 brought together a range of different organizations to try and build some market consensus on some key topics within impact measurement and management. And we did this by bringing together a range of disciplines, so investors, social scientists, government, development, finance, to see if we could identify some best practices and some common fundamentals when it comes to measuring social and environmental impact. And this consensus building effort distilled down to 5 dimensions of performance that seem to show up time and time again as this community looked across these different disciplines. And so thanks, Colin. So I'll just dive straight into those. And what you can see here is what the community of practitioners seem to be sensibly agreeing when it comes to definitions of outcome and impact, and then indeed the dimensions of performance that you need to understand an impact. So, and that is that an outcome is, in the context of impact management, if it's defined as a result of an action or event, which is some aspect of social, environmental, or economic well-being, then an impact is then the change in that outcome that is caused by an organization. And that can be directly or indirectly caused, wholly or partially, and intentionally or unintentionally. And then we have these 5 dimensions that came up time and time again. And just briefly going through them, they're essentially a set of management questions that to be able to think about applying resources to have different impact across an organization. The questions that need to be answered, and they are that what outcome is occurring, whether is it positive and negative, and how important is it to those that are experiencing it? Who is experiencing the outcome, and how underserved are they in relation to that outcome? And then thinking about the significance of that outcome across kind of 3 sub-dimensions of how many people are experiencing it, the degree of change, and how long the impact lasts for. And contribution, so what is the enterprise's contribution to an outcome versus what would have otherwise occurred? So thinking about the counterfactual. And then risk, so looking on a forward-looking basis, when you're trying to manage an impact, what is the risk that the intended impact doesn't occur as expected, or perhaps worse, an unintended negative impact occurs? And those dimensions of impact can be further broken down into categories of information. And I won't belabor these others than to point out that these are simply categories of information which help answer those basic management questions that the 5 dimensions represent. So for example, if you want to understand whether an outcome is positive or negative, you need to compare it to a threshold for what level is good enough, and you need to measure the outcome level in the period. To think about the stakeholder perspective, you need to understand what the stakeholder believes to be the relative importance versus the other impacts that the organization may be having on that stakeholder. And that helps prioritize the impacts for management. Understand whether the organization is well served or underserved the stakeholder. You need information on the baseline level of outcome for the stakeholder, and you might collect some socio-demographic information to help with segmentation. And that carries on down through the rest of these dimensions. But an important point to point out here is that the IMP itself isn't a standard setter. We don't define metrics for each of these data categories. Rather, we work with those structured network members, and among them are organizations that do indeed set metrics. And those standards can certainly be really valuable sources when thinking about the type of data that would need to power this analysis. But of course, not all impacts have been standardized yet. So when an organization is trying to measure an impact in such a situation, the data categories can serve as a useful checklist for the type of information that allows you to build a full picture of an impact. And I just want to sort of emphasize as well that the project was set up to try and think about defining what the ideal set of information would be. And so, of course, the reality when you come to measurement is that so often there's data gaps and you're dealing with proxies, and that's fine. But it's what we found, and when we ran conversations with this, is that it's useful to bear in mind what that complete set of information would be, so that you can then think about what risks you're taking when you're making decisions with incomplete data. And assessing data across the 5 dimensions that way is helpful because it allows you to identify patterns of performance when you look at that performance. So on the slide here, you can see that there are obviously cases when you have no information and you may be causing harm. Then there's cases where perhaps you recognize that there are negative outcomes being generated, but nothing is being done about it, so causing harm. And then there's situations where actually an organization recognizes that they're generating negative outcomes, but they do something about it. They're acting to reduce or avoid that harm. Then there's situations where an organization goes further than that and is actually generating positive outcomes for its stakeholders. And they know that because when they compare the outcome to a threshold, it's within the range for what would be considered good enough. And then there's, again, organizations that go further still and say, not only are we generating positive outcomes, but we're generating those positive outcomes for stakeholders that would be otherwise underserved in relation to that outcome when we compare it to a counterfactual. And in that case, we're contributing to solutions. And so this is helpful in that when an organization is measuring impact, of course, it's a combination of multiple impacts. And so being able to classify impacts in this way is useful when the nature of an impact can be so different across, even within an organization, but even as you start to think from the investor's perspective, across different organizations that might be in different geographies or in different sectors, being able to talk about impact in these very general terms is a useful way to be able to communicate impact across the investment value chain. And so if we move to the next slide, thanks Colin. You can see here that actually when we ran conversations with wealth managers and other investors, we found that broadly speaking, the motivations of an investor can also be categorized into these 3 categories of A, B, and C. So you have some investors that are perhaps for regulatory reasons, acting to avoid harm, or perhaps they are just looking to behave responsibly. And there's some that are going further and saying, actually, we want to invest in organizations that are going above and beyond and positively affecting their stakeholders. And then there's some that are quite focused in their ambition to really contribute to solutions or solve social and environmental issues. And so the idea then is that if you have organizations that are collecting information across the 5 dimensions to be able to answer those management questions and then able to classify their impacts according to these ABC categories, you then have a meeting of the minds between organizations that are generating impact of a certain type and investors who are seeking impact and seeking to deliver and fund impact of that certain type according to those ABC categories. And then there's the further piece here, which is, of course, not only is the impact of the underlying asset an important component of in total impact of investment, but also the investor has a role to play as well. And I won't go through these in great detail because I want to make sure that we can get on to what I think most of you are interested in, which is seeing how this has been applied in practice. But when we ran conversations on this, found that broadly speaking, practitioners identified 4 strategies that investors can employ to enable the impact of their underlying investments. They are that they can signal that impact matters, so use their capital allocation choice to signal that measurable impact matters as part of their investment decision making. They can go above and beyond and engage actively to really put impact management onto the agenda of a company. They can use their capital to grow in undersupplied capital markets, so providing capital on cost terms or amounts that wouldn't otherwise be available to a company, and that is instrumental in enabling impact that wouldn't otherwise occur. And then finally, they can provide flexibility on risk-adjusted return, and recognizing that some types of impact require, from the outset, recognizing that the investment will take a sub-commercial return. So hopefully that's the sort of whistle-stop tour of the impact management project and gives you some context and background for what we're up to and some of the consensus building work that we've done. I'm going to leave it there now and hand over to Tracey to talk more about how Grow have been incorporating these norms into their own business. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me on the screen?
Yes.
Firstly, thank you very much for joining us. We have more than 90 people who've joined us today. And thank you to Colin for affording us this opportunity and for doing this amazing work with us over a period of nearly 6 months. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an intro to Grow Educare Centres so that you have some context, and then we will hand over to Colin and come back to us in terms of really talking through our experience of going through the process, which is really the purpose of today's webinar. So Grow Educare was founded in 2014. It was founded as a sub-project of the Clothing Bank, who many of you will know me for as being the founder. And it was really founded because we were working with women in the Clothing Bank who were working hard to eradicate poverty in their families through the businesses they were creating. And we started to see, by analyzing their financial behaviors, that one of their top priorities was spending money on education. But in most cases, they were seeking high quality education, and they were prepared to contribute a disproportionate percentage of the income to that. And they couldn't find that quality education in their neighborhoods. So they were spending a large amount of money transporting their kids in private door-to-door taxis to get their child to a centre that offered better quality. And that's really where the idea came from. So in 2004, we wanted to bring high quality early learning to every community in South Africa. And so we established a social franchising model, firstly in the Western Cape. We opened our first school in Langa, and we now have more than 21 centres in Cape Town, 22 centres in Cape Town, and we subsequently expanded to KZN and Gauteng in 2017 and 2018. We now have 44 centres around the country, which has 100 teachers and support over 220 jobs. And just before lockdown, we had more than 1,500 children enrolled in those centres. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Colin. So our theory of change is we really have a two-pronged theory of change. Priority number one is to ensure that we offer children in these centres high quality learning. And what we mean by that is that we service children from the ages of 2 to 5, that they need to come out of a growth school absolutely school ready, ready to engage in the learning process of the formal schooling system and meeting all the benchmark milestones for the age group. But also, mostly importantly, in order for that model to be sustainable, We need women who are running these centers to run professional centers that are financially sustainable, and to pay women that primarily work in these centers what they're worth. The sector really is very undervalued, and mostly women who work in this sector are earning well below minimum wage. And you will see that in some of our outcomes. And we believe by combining these two, they are equal pillars in our model, that we will get sustained impact within the early learning sector in South Africa. So we've been building this model for 5 years. We look for women who started a creche or a center within her community, but it's largely a babysitting service. It has very few, very little educational equipment. It mostly won't comply to health and safety standards, and she has limited training and know-how how to offer quality education, and even less limited training around how to run a professional, sustainable business. So we go through a detailed selection process and then sign up women who join us for a 5-year journey. So our theory is change is really not about a quick fix solution. We believe that sustained change comes by developing new practices and new ways of doing that. And so we journey with a woman for 5 years. We start by offering funding and are moving more and more to loan funding for infrastructure upgrade and extensive educational equipment, which goes with training. And then we journey with her by providing her all the training, education, and business mentoring, and the complete recipe for success to guide her every step of the way to becoming what we call a 5-star center. And recently, we've been very fortunate to have been able to invest in developing what we call the Grow app, which is a cell phone-based app that is a key tool for her throughout this process that really guides her through the process and provides her with the tools and the processes to follow. So the clothing bank and Grow have always been crazy about measurement, and that might have something to do with the fact that I'm an accountant, and measurement is everything. And so we've always had well-established practices of measuring things. And last year we wrote up that measurement system, or that theory of change related to measurement, into this model, which is what we call our 5-star model. So we believe that these are the things we need to measure in order to meet our stated impact, as I outlined earlier. So we have 5 pillars of measurement. We measure quality teaching, and within quality teaching, you will see the sub-measures that we have there. And for those of you that are in the impact management world, they are deliberately a mixture between input, output, and impact measures. And in our calculation model behind that, they are differently weighted, dependent on what we feel is the most important levers of success. This monitoring system is integrated into our entire system. So it's not a one-off event. We're measuring and monitoring throughout our interactions, throughout the 5-year process, from baseline all the way to the end, and is now all of these measurement KPIs are integrated into our Grow app. And you will see that this was the foundation on which we were able to build our impact statement. If we didn't have these clearly defined metrics in place, I think we wouldn't have been able to actually achieve that. And you'll see that is certainly one of the lessons learned that we'll come to later. So that just gives you a bit of a background. I'm going to hand over to Colin now.
Great, thank you, Tracey. Let me get on screen. So what we wanted to do to share with you today is, rather than go into the detail of the impact report and statement, is to give you some, I would say, broad experiential insights. So what are the things that we learned together? What are the things that we did? Because ultimately what we would like to see is you taking what we did as an inspiration into your organizations, and to be able to guide not only the way your organizations are measuring impact, but how you can then communicate that to your donors and investors. So to give you a sense of what that journey looked like for us, my business partner and wife, Gabrielle, has known about the Impact Management Project for some time, and mentioned to me that I should pay a little bit of attention to it, which I did, and I went to go meet James in London in late October 2019. After coming back from there, pretty inspired about not only the message of the IMP, but I think specifically what its progress has been. I think for anybody that's worked in the space and has had to find indicators and measures that apply to their work to be able to not only measure their impact, but communicate it to third parties, one of the biggest issues is comparability. How do you get to a place where you can compare impact between one organization and another? How can an investor or donor know what they're investing in? And how can organizations know that they're delivering towards that? And the IMP provides, in our opinion, an excellent framework to be able to assist with that process. And with that inspiration, we went to go and see Tracey and her team at the end of last year, and scheduled a couple of workshops, discovery workshops at the beginning of this year, to look at what their strategy was, what their operations were, what their lessons were, and where they'd like to apply it. And as Tracey has mentioned, the most appropriate focal point inside their organization and the amazing work that they do was grow. When they turned around and said, well, would you be interested in wanting to look at the data from 2014 to 2019? 5 years is not what we were expecting. But once we started to think carefully about it and realize that being able to see this framework in practice actually requires data, impact data as it changes over time, to be able to assess the various aspects and the applicability of the IMP norms. We not only grabbed that opportunity with both hands, sat down and got to understand Tracey and her team's theory of change and their outcomes, and quite a lot of the time was spent on taking data that had been collected over that period of time. And as you can imagine, an organization go through changes over that period. And so we had to normalize that data to get to the point where the data from an internal perspective, that it was comparable, never mind able to be applied to an external framework. We had to look at various systems, and we had the help of a system called SOPACT. There are other impact management information systems around, which are certainly helpful and you might be using. But ultimately, it was being able to take that data and get to a point where we could start analyzing that and bring it into a place where we could start to find that comparability that we know is almost the holy grail in this space. And after quite some time of working with one another, we worked through a number of iterations of both the impact statement, which looked at the IMP norms, but then translated those norms into a narrative, which is now the impact report for Grow for 2014 to 2019. And we delivered that in June 2020. Now, what did that process look like if we were to break it down into its past? The first stage of that process is engagement. And I think it's critically important in establishing scope and purpose, not only with whoever your analyst might be in looking at the information, but importantly, being able to establish that scope and purpose with your investors as well. It can be a painful process to go through trying to understand each other's objectives and realize that your understanding of the word purpose or the word impact can actually have a fundamental detrimental effect on how you are gathering your data and how you ultimately report on that data. So the engagement process was critical. The next stage is discovery. So how can you co-create a methodology? In our case, we had the benefit that Grow, and as Tracey mentioned, has been fastidious about the data that they've collected over time. And so in that case, there wasn't a necessity for implementing a new data gathering system or a data gathering process. It was merely being able to look at the data and then decide on a methodology that we felt was going to suit the data that we had, and certainly suited the purpose of how that data needed to be analyzed, then packaged, and then presented. The next stage of the process was data collection, and being able to map the various stakeholders and the systems that we were going to use, and making sure that once again was formed in collaboration and not isolation. And then from an analysis perspective, which is fundamental to impact management and measurement, as a number of you will know, it's not just a case of finding the right framework. It's also about applying the right indicators and the right standards to how that data is going to be ultimately measured. So whether that is assessing what benchmarks that you're working from, and in our case, we had the benefit of 5 years worth of data. So we had benchmarks that went back for 5 years, and we could assess how the various centers had performed against those benchmarks, but then also standards. What were the external standards that exist that provide the type of thresholds around what incomes teachers and principals should be earning, what fees should be, and how those also change over time for reasons that are socioeconomic. They're not things that are necessarily constant. And then finally, in terms of step 5, looking at how you wish to report on that information. From our perspective, we believe that an impact report is a critical part of your storytelling, that it shouldn't be the type of document that gets filed in a dusty corner where, you know, the odd person who happens to ask for it, or your board who needs to sign for it, needs to pay attention to it. We believe that an impact report is a statement not only of your evidence, but also of the difference that you make. It's how you deliver on the promises that you make, not only to your stakeholders, but also to your donors and investors as well. And so we spend time on addressing that question. What is the format and what is the function that this particular report should perform for growth? So to tell you and to share with you just a little snapshot, literally, of what these look like. We will share the impact and as well as the impact statement with you post this event, and we look forward to being able to spend time with you in sharing the details of what's inside that. But obviously our session today doesn't give us all that much time to go into too much detail. The next stage of the process. There we go. Just muting all participants, sorry. Looking at the highlights of the report and statement. These are graphs that come out of the report itself, and hopefully you can read them nice and clearly. But the highlights that we wanted to share with you is that what the impact report allowed us to be able to demonstrate and to provide for Grow is taking the detail of their data and give them evidence of impact by being able to look at what those changes were over time. Interestingly, however, when it came to looking at the data, the impact progress, and this is an important thing to mention as well, to highlight, is that when it comes to impact reporting, do not expect it to be a linear J-shaped graph. It accounts for externalities. It accounts for the types of impacts, thinking about COVID, thinking about shifts in an economy that might impact the work that you are doing that are outside of your control, but are important factors that need to be communicated to your donors and to your investors, as well as your other stakeholders involved. When it came to the data, what we spent a lot of time speaking to the IMP about, what we spent a lot of time chatting to the Grow team about, is making sure that setting the benchmarks and thresholds were relevant to what they were doing and how they were doing it. In some cases, and Grow, as for those of you that know Tracey and her team, are not short of ambition. In some cases, those thresholds that they set for themselves were incredibly high. Were they reasonable? Yes, they were certainly reasonable, but it doesn't mean they were immediately attainable. What was important, though, is to show what difference they had made from the baseline that they were working from. And I think that's what is key, is that you need to be able to understand what are your benchmarks in relation to the counterfactual evidence that might exist. What difference are you as an organization making? What is that particular impact that organization is having on the environment? And then setting the types of thresholds that start to not only give you certain goals, but start to make you become more ambitious, or to then measure or mitigate your ambitions in terms of what you can actually deliver, and use it as a decision-making tool and a tool for understanding that you can share with your investors and donors to manage their expectations as well. From an insights perspective, it allows for multiple perspectives. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to looking at the 5 IMP norms, you're looking at fairly broad categories where you can apply different indicators and standards to the same data. And that's what becomes critically important, is that by assuming a set of norms that allows comparability, you can start looking at your data and how it impacts even the smaller details of your business processes in a manner that can give you deeper insight into your organization, its ability to find efficiencies, and definitely to be able to enhance its effectiveness. And then finally, in terms of alignment, we found that by being able to look at the data as a set of independent parties, the role that we played in the process in putting the impact report together, and then being able to work with GROW, one of the statements that were made in the process is that too many organizations are marking their own homework, to use an analogy. And by being able to bring in independent and being able to use an independent framework that allows comparability, what that allows is the ability to build team commitment around what your purpose is, being able to understand at depth what your theory of change is, being able to assess whether certain adjustments to your theory of change might be required, looking at what outcomes you've been able to deliver, and being able to understand what aspects of your inputs, activities, and outputs are leading to those outcomes that you are delivering. So I'm going to hand back to Tracey now to give her perspective on what purpose the process gave to Grow Educare and her team. Yeah, over to you, Trace.
Thanks, Colin. You know, I've been a social entrepreneur for 10 years, as I said earlier, and I can, without question, say that this is one of the most useful processes that we've ever participated in. And, you know, most external evaluation reports, I find, come in and don't really use the data that you already have. They come in, interview you using their own interview questionnaires, interview your beneficiaries, interview your various stakeholders, and then give you, you know, a very qualitative report on what is their perspective of what's working and what's not working. And that really disregards all the, you know, data that we have been gathering for years and years, which has deep, you know, there's an incredible amount of value in that. So that's what I really appreciated about this process. So through our engagement with Colin and his amazing team, we had some very deeply engaging discussions on what we measure and why. And it helped us reflect, you know, there's no point in measuring for the sake of measuring. Why are you measuring something, and what are you going to do with it? It also helped us reflect on really, you know, if you're going to use your internal gathering systems, then you need to place, you need to be very conscious that you know, rubbish in, rubbish out. And every stakeholder and data gatherer in your organization, which for us is down to a teacher recording attendance in the classroom, or a principal recording her expenses for her center, is a valuable attitude, because if you don't have the correct data, and none of this is possible. So you need to build in, like you would build into an accounting system, data validation tools to make sure that you're getting quality data throughout the process. You know, we've always thought of ourselves as having a strong internal monitoring and evaluation process, because, you know, I really, as I come back to being an accountant, I really do want to know, and everybody who works in Grow wants to know whether we really are having an impact. So we are very self-reflective, and we're happy to look in the mirror and you know, stare at the bad news if possible. But what this process did, it really brought it in together in a cohesive way. I think you can notice trends, but unless you do it in with a fixed format like this, it really doesn't help you to sit down and ask yourself, are we having the change that we intended to have today? As a result of this, we realized there were some gaps in our data collection requirements. There was some missing data. Spreadsheets had been not saved as the right version, and all of a sudden, certain things were missing. And again, it spoke to the importance of that data. It is like gold. It certainly helped us test our theory of change, and it helped us share our theory of change completely supported with facts. And hope that you will read the report and be able to very, very clearly and easily understand our model and the impact that it's having. And that brings me to the next point, which the way that Relativ put this report together in a beautiful visual format that is completely accessible and readable for multiple stakeholders. So it has value. Most evaluation reports are purely, in my opinion, designed for the external stakeholder that commissioned them. For me, this report has as much value for internal stakeholders as well as it has for external stakeholders in the future. So what do we see the future value of this? I didn't really know what I was getting myself into when I said yes. I think Colin and his team are fabulous, so I knew we would get some value. But we certainly got a lot more value than we'd ever thought we would. And I do believe that this is a framework for future reporting. This is what annual reports of organizations should look like. If we can use this as an integrated performance management tool that tracks the change in our impact over time with the school, and you will see a lot of the graphs that are in the report show what the 5-year trajectory, tracking our theory of change, what the 5-year trajectory looks at for schools. It really will help us stay on the right path and help us to strategically and critically assess our impact on an ongoing basis. So I don't believe this is an event. This is something that needs to get totally integrated into everything you do and really inform your learning process and your iteration process to achieve your stated impact. I think specifically for sectors, if sectors can work together, one of the biggest challenges that Colin will get to later is what we call the counterfactual, or what James referred to as the contribution. So how do you know that your intervention had impact and that this wouldn't have just happened anyway? And one of the biggest challenges there is to compare it to benchmarks. That is what is required in the model. And in many cases, we found we didn't have benchmarks. So we had to use our own internal benchmarks. And can you imagine if this was applied to sectors? So let's say in the early learning sector, if this was the new standard for reporting across all projects, we could create benchmarks for each of these measures. We have some benchmarks for, the milestones and early learning outcomes that children should be achieving, but we don't have benchmarks for many of the other measures that we measure. There is no understanding what the average salary in the ECD sector is for an NQF level 4 qualified teacher. And the only data we have is more than 5 years old when a big audit is conducted in the sector, which then is stale a year afterwards. So if we collaborated, and this is across any sector that has common benchmarks and standards, to all be producing information like this and share those, we could then compare our impact within a sector. Obviously the stated goal of this tool is to do just that. And we see it as a great opportunity to be able to do that, hopefully, in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracey. So just wrapping up our discussion, and then we'd like to move to some questions. How does this build donor value and investors' trust, and vice versa? Rather than going through each one of these individually, I wanted to list them because we want to make the most of the time for questions. First of all, in terms of trust, how does this build trust with investors and donors? Well, first of all, it gives a perfect opportunity to build a relationship with them and to use that time within the context of your organization and its work to bring them closer, to make them feel like they are participating in that process. From other aspects in terms of trust is that what the output becomes, what the process demands from you as an organization is transparency. And by applying and using this particular set of norms and being able to get your data in this format, which is comparable year on year, and also between your peers and between organizations of similar kinds in other parts of the world, it also creates another level of accountability. In that way, though, it's not only about being able to point out where things are going right or whether they're going wrong, it actually becomes a tool for communication. And so it's not just about communicating to your investors and donors, it's about connecting with other stakeholders, prospects, prospective investors and donors who are looking for impact, who have their own theory of change. And now you can give them and show them exactly what that impact looks like and how you can deliver on their expectations and what they are seeking. We've chatted a lot about the comparability of data, which I think is fundamental to where this whole movement is heading. And one of the factors which I think has been what we've had to learn as an organization and what we've seen in the teams that we've worked with is it requires a level of humility. It requires the ability to look at your organization instead of hiding behind models of how your change is going to take place. It's about looking at the raw data, the actual difference that you are making, not only in terms of the amount of stakeholders that you may have served, clients that you may have served with your work, but more importantly, it's about being able to understand, well, if you weren't there, what difference would it really make? Would there be a gap if you suddenly didn't do the work that you do? And I think by taking that approach allows you to be far more innovative. It allows you to really adopt this level of transparency in such a way that makes your value proposition stronger and gives you a confidence in being able to approach investors and donors in ways that you may not have discovered before. From a success perspective, how can this build success? Well, we believe that it's one thing building a theory of change in isolation. It's a completely different thing making sure that that's co-created with your investors and donors. As I'm sure many of you are working with at this time, large foundations, and in particular, impact investors are starting to adopt theories of change as their strategic planning tools. And being able to look at how yours matches with them or being able to develop projects that are co-created allows for far more collaboration, but I think also relationship building, and it builds that common vision that allows you to be able to not only declare what your work is, but actually set achievable thresholds because your investors and donors are working that path with you and with an active participation instead of a passive participation, giving you a list of requirements of what need to be delivered and then asking you questions why they weren't delivered over time. The one thing we did find, and I think this was conveyed through what Tracey mentioned, is to what extent is impact measurement and management an imperative in your organization? If there was one, I think, organizational, structural insight that came out of this process, and this is from an organization that is already data orientated, it was a requirement for an organization to be able to deliver on what an impact report requires, that all staff members need to understand what it is, the contribution that they make to it, and how every single piece of work they are involved in contributes ultimately to the story that you're going to tell through the data that you're collecting as part of your evidence for change. And in so doing, that it becomes learning that happens within your internal stakeholder sets as well as with your external stakeholders. And ultimately, by being able to have this evidence, for those of you that are expert storytellers already, it allows you to leverage your storytelling far beyond your current investor and donor environment, being able to take your story far much wider, but not only locally, regionally, but internationally as well, seeking out the type of investors and donors that are aligned to your work and who are actually going to make positive contributions to your respective futures. From a school fees perspective, we wanted to share with you some of the things that we learned in the process, so that you perhaps don't have to learn them yourselves when you take the same journey. So spend time planning and build a common understanding about your systems, your analysts, and your reports. Identify the right partners through that process. Make sure that when it comes to putting together an impact report, it's not something that you do at the end of the year and just make sure you do and tick a box because you know it's the type of thing that some of your stakeholders are going to require, but that becomes a collaborative exercise, that the evidence that you are collecting is critical to being able to make that a document of value and to leverage the success that I was chatting about in the previous slide. Be prepared to make sense of inconsistencies. Not everything moves in straight lines in development work, as you well know. When it comes to wanting to deliver purpose, as it does in running any business, things are not always consistent, but it's important to make sense of what those inconsistencies were. Coming back to what Tracey mentioned around counterfactuals and the contributions, what are the ways in which you need to make sense of your environment so you can communicate that to your investors and donors so they understand you better. Benchmarks to determine thresholds might be hard to find. And in some cases, you might need to be setting those benchmarks and thresholds. The great thing about the Grow Impact Report is we have fresh data that can become the type of reference point for this type of work in future. And so you can set the standard. You can start to become the thought leader in your particular environment. It's not always about looking for third parties. Sometimes those reference points are not available. They don't exist. And onboarding your entire team as contributors to the success of the project are essential. To the final 2 points, and then we're going to move to the questions and answers. When in doubt, be brave enough to justify your own experience. Remember, you are the experts. You are closest to the work that you are doing. And in some ways that you might need to be humble and shoot some of your sacred cows inside your organization. By the same token, there is reason to be bold about what your work is and how it affects change if you have the evidence to prove that. And you can package that evidence that other people can understand what that is and how it works. And then finally, and importantly, that delivering impact is not a consistent upward trajectory, as I've mentioned before. It is a process that requires intense work. It is something that is frustrating because just when you think that you've found the answer to a particular problem and now it's time to scale and to change systems, all of a sudden by then implementing it in another environment doesn't seem to work out in the same way. But that is not reason to be discouraged. It's reason to try and track the reasons why and to start learning from those processes and start building the breadth of your impact and take that knowledge and share it with your peers, share it with your team, and share it with your donors and investors to build trust and success with them. On that note, I want to turn to the Q&A section. And I see that there's a number of questions that have come through and would like to see what we have here. So let's have a look at the first one. Yeah, okay, so here we go. Yeah, right, how would this work in developmental microfinance institutions that assist micro-enterprises with a strong focus on social impact? James, could I turn to you in terms of your experience, the IMP's experience with microfinance institutions? Do you have any international reference points to assist Asido with his question?
Hi, Colin. I'm just looking through the questions. Could you repeat that one?
Yeah.
You just broke up just at the beginning there.
No problem. So when it comes to development microfinance institutions, that assist micro enterprises with a strong focus on social impact, how would the IMP and impact reporting assist organizations such as those? Do you have any experience internationally of seeing that?
So the one that springs to mind is one of the practitioners in our community that does work with financial institutions is Quona. They work in a number of emerging markets on financial technology, which is working with microfinance institutions, and so they've produced several reports actually over the last few years, which is using the IMP norm. So, and that's available on the IMP resources page if you're interested. So it might be worth. I'd direct you to look at the Quona impact reports as a practical example there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks, James. I've got one for Tracey. Tracey, how has your strategy changed or been enhanced through the process of applying the IMP's norms and receiving the report?
Great, thanks for the question. I think what it really helped us do is zero in on some of the metrics that we were measuring. And, you know, when Colin replayed the graph back to us, I kind of got a knot in the bottom of my stomach, and I'll talk to two. One being a key goal of ours is to get our schools registered. And, you know, and we thought we were doing a pretty good job, you know, kind of ticking the boxes as we went. But when we stared at the graph, we weren't doing a good enough job. It was clear that it was taking us far too long a time, and we didn't really understand what the obstacles were. So it really helped us, you know, zero in on that, take a really deep dive in that, and then, you know, face that obstacle head on and try and develop strategies around that. It's not an easy one because there's some hard obstacles in the way, but you've got to keep trying, and the measure helped us with that. If we look at teacher salaries, you know, teacher salaries are a key measure for us. We want women to be paid what they're worth. We want quality teachers in our schools, but teacher salaries have stayed stubbornly low. And so what we did is we launched a lot of workshops within our organization around talking about salaries, why it's important to pay quality teachers a good income, why it's important to comply with the law. And we just started those round of talks actually because it came up early in this reporting, pre-COVID, trying to make sure that all of our centres had registered their staff for UIF. Now, unfortunately, not all of them had, but those that had now realised the importance of it. So, you know, it really helps you focus in on the areas where you're working hard, but are you really having the impact that you set out to have?
Mm. Thanks, Tracey. There's a couple of questions around comparability. And James, seeing that you are our special guest from the north today, could I ask you this question that's come up a few times in different formats? What is the value of comparing? 100% see the value of measuring and proper analytics, but need some clarity regarding comparability from Erna. Thanks for the question, Erna.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So really it comes down to decision making and choosing between options. So I guess we sort of touched on briefly, an organization is, you know, it's not just one impact, it's a combination of many impacts. And the idea then is that as an organization, if you collect information across 5 dimensions for each of your material impacts, you then can have a level of comparability when it comes to choosing, you know, where I apply resources in terms of like maximizing a positive impact on or minimizing a negative. So that's, I mean, that's really the main focus at the organizational level. And then of course, at the as you move up the investment value chain, it becomes more about capital allocation. So being able to compare impacts for investment purposes and allocation of capital.
Thank you, James. Another question from Neo. Thanks for the question. How long did it take for the full project accounting for learnings that needed to take place? In our case, Neo, in this particular example, there was a lot of learning that we needed to take place as teams working on the project. So we did a calculation that it would have taken, I think it amounted to 36 working days. From start to finish. If we look at the time, the actual time, there was a lot more time spent in kind of processing the information backwards and forwards. And I think Tracey's team would probably say it took them possibly the same, maybe more time from their side in getting the data together. But if we were to look at the process again and realize where we could find efficiencies, I think you could probably bring that down to about 12 working days. Once again, that is dependent on the quality of the data, the availability of the data, and certainly the systems and the team that's allocated to doing the project. Discovery process is absolutely essential to reduce the amount of time it's going to take to deliver. Here's a question from Helene. What are the financial implications of applying the IMP framework? How expensive is this to process, from data collection and analytics to compiling the report? So I gave you a sense of what the time investment is, and you can translate that to what daily rates might be, depending on your organization. But the expense relates to largely, once again, as I said, what is your data capabilities? Do you have the data available versus do you still need to collect that? And once again, until you've actually had a detailed engagement and discovery process, it'll be difficult to be able to give an assessment before that time. Here is a question from Joshua. And I see we've just gone past 3 o'clock, so please, if you do feel the need to step out, you do need to go, please feel free to do so. All the questions that we have, we will respond to the individuals, but if you're happy to stay on and to listen to some of the questions, we can share those. What about programs aided very broad objectives? Where is the journey of progress for a beneficiary? What if the journey of progress for a beneficiary is so varied that using a fixed set of metrics would fail to capture the full impact? Okay, so can I throw that back to you, James, as a final question before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think I mean that's another really great question. Well, I think the approach that we see others taking is that, of course, you're absolutely right. When an organization is having an impact, it can be so far reaching that at some point you have to decide, well, where is practical to begin to measure? And it may be that the impact is very long term and it's just not practical to be able to measure something that's, I don't know, say 10 years down the line. So then you have to row back from that outcome and think about, well, what's a nearer term outcome, or what's an outcome that's closer to the organization's, within the organization's control that I can measure. And then when you're trying to understand, whether this closer outcome is indeed leading to that longer term outcome, is then when you have to look to sort of secondary research to see whether there is a kind of causal link between the outcomes that you are measuring and the outcome that you're sort of intending to achieve that is more difficult to measure. But on the point of, there could be many different outcomes which are relevant. There's no, it's not a definitive that you can only measure one impact per stakeholder group. If there are important material impacts within a stakeholder group and that are different, then it may well be worth collecting metric sets for multiple outcomes that affect a particular stakeholder group.
Thanks, James.
Comes down to resources, though, as I'm sure you appreciate, Colin.
Yeah, exactly, and something which we discovered in our process as well. I think that the whole point of the journey is not to try and capture everything that you can, because as you say, there's limited time, there's limited resources. but always a good start to see what you have. And fundamentally, I think that what made this a success that in our time working with Grow is the fact that they had a defined theory of change. They knew their organization and what they wanted to accomplish. We were given 5 years of data, which actually, it may sound like that's quite a significant ask, but when you look at it from the perspective that the theory of change was consistent, so in actual fact, you could look at the data over that period of time with levels of consistency and compare it year on year. And in that process, and the process that I know that Tracey and her team went through, is they refined their theory of change over that period, is definitely the other benefit, aside from obviously being donor and investor orientated. I'm aware that we are over time, and we thoroughly are enjoying all the information that is coming through and the questions. But I am aware that for everybody else, we'd like to respect your time. What I would like to commit to is that we will take note of all these questions. We can see who the people that have asked the questions, and hopefully we can match them up with your email addresses that we do have. We will send this recording out to you. A link to that, plus a copy of the report as well as the statement, with the intention for us to continue this conversation with you. And if there's a way that we can assist you and guide you in your own journey with regards to this, we certainly hope that we can add some value there. And once again, allow you to not pay some of the school fees that we have already. So I want to thank, first of all, our speakers today, Tracey and James. Thank you so much for your time. I also want to thank the incredible teams that were behind delivering this piece of work. I think I can speak on behalf of Tracey, James, and myself that behind our voices and our faces, there are incredible groups of people that make our work possible and made this project possible. And we're very proud to share it with you as something which we hope is going to catalyze your organizations and to take you further. So on that note, thank you very much. We hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we will be in touch.
Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone.